Alright, this video is going to be completely different from my other ones. I'm not going to be doing editing here, and this is completely spontaneous. So right now, there's a YouTube channel named the Unrepentant Atheist, and during a live stream I represented an argument from contingency. It's not my argument, to make that clear. It's an argument from Joshua Rasmussen and Alexander Pruse's book called Necessary Existence, and I wanted to see how they would engage with this argument, and I made it clear when I presented it that it did not establish God. It was stage 1, and if they granted it, I'd be happy to move on to a stage 2 where I attempt to establish the necessary thing that's concluded in stage 1. I wanted to establish stage 1. Once I do that, stage 2 attempts to identify that necessary thing as God. And yeah, that the stage 1 was not an argument for God, and it shouldn't be taken as that, and shouldn't be critiqued along those lines, that it failed to establish God. Sure enough, what do you think happened? Well, the Unrepentant Atheist and some of his followers critiqued me, saying, well, the argument doesn't establish God. Yeah, that's a failure to pay attention. What's going on right now? What's the situation? Well, there's sort of a war zone in the comments. There's like 80 comments under the community post. What I want to do here is, I want to make some things clear, because a lot of the attacks to the argument have been predicated on misunderstandings or whatever, and I just want to get these things on the table. Once these things are on the table, I want to see if there's like any legitimate criticisms of the argument left, and then address those. And then maybe lay out like a vague stage 2. I don't want to spend time and effort working out the stage 2 if people won't grant or agree with stage 1. It's a waste of my time, obviously. So, what are the confusions? Well, actually, no. I should probably start with what's the argument. The argument, to me, I thought was clear, but people seem to take difficulty with the usage of a lot of words and some maybe philosophically precise words that they're not so familiar with. So what I'm going to do here is, I'm going to say the actual argument with the whole careful deployment of terms. Then I'm going to say effectively what the argument in more simple terms is communicating, and then I'll show why those words alleviate some advanced philosophical difficulties, just briefly though. The argument in its more like rigorous form, if you want to call it that, is for any particular contingent concrete things, there's an explanation of the fact that those things exist. Premise 2, considering all the contingent concrete things that exist. If there's an explanation of the fact that those things exist, then there's a necessary concrete thing. Granting both premises, we get the conclusion that there's a necessary concrete thing. What's the argument simply communicating? Well, it's simply communicating the fact that all contingent things have an explanation, and thus, on pain of circularity, there must be a necessary thing. So why employ the words for any particular, concrete, right? Why those words? Well, I'm not going to get into this, but there are objections to the argument from contingency that show that if you take all of the contingent concrete things that exist, and if you treat that as a set, then you could get set theoretic paradoxes. In an attempt to avoid those paradoxes, because they're problematic, we use plural designation instead of referring to all contingent things as some sort of set, right? Okay, so that's one thing taken care of that some people, or at least one person, was confused by. Some people wanted me to define the terms I used, and I'm not sure which ones, so I'll define the relevant terms here. Let me just recall the argument for any particular contingent. Okay, so contingent thing, I want to make this very clear, is not per se a dependent thing. That's not how it's defined. It may turn out that we have independent reason to think that all contingent things are dependent on other things, but that's not how a contingent thing is defined. And I'm emphasizing this because it's a mistake people frequently make. In fact, Matt Dillahunty makes this mistake. You could watch his response to the argument from contingency. I think it's like a 37-minute video. He makes that mistake, right? So a contingent thing is not defined as a dependent thing. Rather, a contingent thing is something that exists in some, but not all possible worlds. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, possible worlds could be looked at as just possibilities, like actually possible circumstances, actually possible ways things could have been. So, if I say a contingent thing is something that exists in some but not all possible worlds, what am I really saying? I'm saying that there are some possibilities under which a contingent thing exists, if it's contingent, right? And then there are some possibilities under which a contingent thing does not exist. That's what makes it contingent, if there are some possibilities under which it does not exist. Now, of course, a necessary thing, there's no possibility under which it does not exist. Okay, concrete. Concrete is simple. Concrete just means possibly causes something. For any particular contingent concrete thing, there's an explanation of the fact that those things exist. Does anything else need to be clarified there? Maybe explanation. So there's a lot of ink spilled over like what exactly an explanation is, but there's a general consensus that it's sort of impossible to totally define explanation in the same way that maybe it's totally impossible to define time without, postulating a somewhat circular definition. Explanation may, not in the same sense, but at least in a similar regard, has this fundamental nature, rendering it hard to cleanly define. And when I say fundamental, if you notice a lot of concepts that are sort of first principles that we assume, all those sorts of things are notoriously difficult to define. So for instance, consciousness is just like an axiomatic assumption that most have. Impossible to define, really. Existence, like I said, time, space. Well, actually, I'm not so sure about space, but time is definitely hard to define without circularity. Anyway, I don't want to get too caught up here, but yeah, explanation is one of those things that's hard to cleanly define. However, here are some things typically offered in the context of defining explanation. Explanation makes clear as to why a particular thing is the case. It sort of removes mystery. It removes puzzlement as to why a particular thing obtained. Now that's epistemological, and there are more ontological ways of cashing out explanation. So some might say, well, an explanation is what accounts for a given situation. So the explanands are what make it such that the explanandum obtains. Okay, so I think that's everything that needs to be defined out of the way. Now, I did not offer support for the premises. Now, before I do that, I want to make something very clear. A lot of people, and I mean a lot of people, have objected that the argument is somehow wrong, deficient, confused, inadequate, or whatever, because I didn't support the premises. Some have even employed what's called Hitchens' razor, which is the catchphrase, sort of, to the effect of that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Now, let's get something clear. If any argument is given, let's just say I give an argument to the effect of premise A, premise B, therefore conclusion C. And I offer no evidence. That's all I say, right? I say, granting premise A, granting premise B, you get conclusion C. That's my argument. And I offer nothing more. Now, if I just do that, absent additional reason to negate my argument, absent additional reason to think my argument is false, you actually cannot maintain that it is false. Now, I want to make this very clear. I'm not saying my argument is true. I'm obviously not saying that. If I go, my argument is A, B, therefore C, and I offer no evidence, my argument should not be taken, absent additional information, as false, and it should not be taken as true. You should remain agnostic as to whether or not the argument works. Here's an analogy to make this very obvious. If I make the claim that the number of stars in existence is even, and I offer no argument for that claim, you go, what's the evidence for that, right? And I go, nope, that's my argument. The number of stars in existence is even. If you deny my argument, if you dismiss it in a denying way, as opposed to being agnostic, if you just wholesale, your argument is wrong, I negate it, that actually commits you to affirming that there's an odd number of stars in existence, which is a hilarious position to be in. That means that if I want you to have a particular belief, all I need to do is affirm some random belief without evidence, and you're just going to deny it, entailing your acceptance of the denial of my claim. So if I claim P, now you're going to be committed to not P, which is hilarious. I claim that there are no aliens without evidence. You deny the claim, now you're committed to the claim that there are aliens. How do we get out of this? Very simple. There's agnosticism, right? If someone purports an argument without evidence, don't reject it. If there's no evidence, just remain agnostic. Unless, of course, you have additional reason to think the argument's false. The problem was that a lot of the people objecting to my argument didn't have that additional reason. They just rejected the argument. And I'm like, okay, why do you reject it? And then they go, clarify your terms. I'm like, no. Your rejection of my argument is independent of how I define the terms. You're taking an active stance here. You're saying that my argument is false. Rejecting it is the claim, not P. If I'm claiming P and you reject P, you are committed to not P. So when I ask, okay, what's the argument for not P, you can't go, well, clarify P. No. You just committed to not P. You should know what that is. You should know what you're talking about. You just affirmed a claim. What's the argument for the position? So some people have responded, well, define your argument, or define your terms. Some people have said you offered no support. Again, that should entail your agnosticism with respect to my argument, not the denial of it. Now, just generally speaking, when you're engaging with somebody, and they offer an argument, and they don't support particular premises or all of their premises, the charitable thing to do, the thing you should do as a productive interlocutor, is not go, well, actually, I dismiss your argument because you offer no support. Or, actually, I'm agnostic about your argument because I offer no support. I mean, you could do the latter, but I think the appropriate thing to do is just simply go, okay, premise 1, for instance, doesn't seem intuitive to me. What's the support for that? Or, actually, I disagree with premise 2. Absent support, what's the support? Pretty simple. All you need to do is ask, rather than assume the falsehood of the argument because no support was offered. And by the way, had anyone done that, had anyone simply asked for the support, I would have given it. But it so happened to be that everybody in the comments that asked for support only did so after they said that my argument was like false or confused or something. And at that point, I don't need to give support. You've made the active claim. What's the justification for it? Had someone simply gone, hey, what's the support for premise 1? I'd be off and running. Fine. With that out of the way, what's the support for the premises? Recall premise 1, for any particular contingent concrete things that exist, there's an explanation of the fact that those things exist. Okay, why think that's true? I have a lot of reasons to think it's true. Here I'm going to offer the 4 reasons offered in the book Necessary Existence. And there are far more reasons, by the way. I'll just offer these. Reason number 1, inductive generalization. Premise 1, I have observed countless contingent concrete things having explanations, never observed the contrary, and never observed a contingent concrete thing being the case, while simultaneously observing or knowing or being able to infer that there's no explanation for why that particular thing is the case. This isn't only true of my observations, it's true of everyone's. Alright, reason number 2. The principle seems to be a priori. What does that mean? Well, the principle seems like the kind of thing, and I'm going to offer reasons as to why you should think it's a priori. I'm not just going to state it. Well, first, what is a priori? Well, a priori is something that is not derived from experience, and this is not in conflict with my first support. My first support was merely that the principle is supported by experience, not that it was derived from experience, right? So a priori just means not derived from experience, but rather a sort of innate knowledge, something that you can know upon mere reflection, without having to. And again, I'm stressing the point, without having to, because I want to make it clear that this is not in conflict with my earlier support. It's something you can know upon reflection without having to go empirically confirm it. Why think that this is in the category of a priori knowledge, right? Why think that the principle is actually a priori? Well, here's an example. This example is so overused in this context, I don't know why everyone employs this example when it comes to trying to demonstrate that the principle is a priori. You're walking in a forest, blue orb is found, I pick up the blue orb, I tell you it's uncaused. You're not going to believe that. And this is independent of, the color of the orb, you interacting with that particular kind of orb before. You know what? Let's just say that the thing we find in the forest is unlike any other thing we've interacted with before, such that we can't make inductive generalizations about it. And even if it wasn't, we could still fail to be able to make inductive generalizations about it for more complex reasons. I'm not going to get into that, but, we're walking in the forest, we find, say, some really odd sphere. You're not going to conclude the sphere is uncaused. It just, began to exist in the woods, absent any explanation or reason or cause. No, you're going to assume it in fact has a cause. Another very quick reason or example of this principle being assumed a priori is science. Science presupposes that things and phenomena have explanations. Science is the practice of looking for those explanations, and science doesn't assume, oh wait, maybe there's just no explanation at all. Right? If a homicide detective finds a body dead, they infer that there's very strong evidence of foul play, or in fact there is foul play. Say a homicide detective finds a body, beheaded, the knife is there, blah, blah, blah. no matter how hard the homicide detective looks, he's not at some point going to go, oh, actually, I think there's actually no explanation at all for this event. All right, reason number 3. The explanatory principle is the simplest explanation as to why we don't observe arbitrary chunks of matter and particles and things, contingent concrete things, beginning to exist without explanation. Why doesn't that happen? Now, in the past, some people have said, oh, well, actually, arbitrary chunks of matter don't come into existence because of, say, like a collocation principle. I'm not making the claim, as Craig mistakenly does, that why we don't see chaos is inexplicable if you deny some sort of causal principle. I'm not making that claim. I'm simply making the claim that this explanatory principle provides, I think, and Rasmussen, Proust thinks, that it provides the simplest explanation as to why, and obviously simplicity is a theoretical virtue, it provides the simplest explanation as to why we don't see arbitrary chunks of matter popping into existence uncaused. And someone might respond, well, actually, the causal principle is not why we don't see arbitrary chunks of matter coming into existence uncaused. The reason we don't see it is because it could happen, but it's just unlikely to. Rasmussen and Proust respond that that doesn't work for complex reasons. Effectively, and this is really short and really oversimplified, effectively they respond, once there are going to be things that can pop into existence uncaused, there's only 3 candidate possible quantities. Oh no, this is going to be too far afield, but okay, scratch that. Yeah, scratch that. There's a response to that, and if someone takes that objection up, not merely because I've said it, but they actually have that objection, I'll be happy to respond. Right, so just to rehash, the third reason is because the explanatory principle provides the simplest explanation as to why we don't see arbitrary chunks of matter spring into existence uncaused out of nothing. The fourth reason, we want to avoid positing an arbitrary line between the explained phenomena and the unexplained phenomena, right? The more a hypothesis leaves things unexplained, the more a hypothesis has internal to it questions that it fails to resolve inherently. Not just like, oh, I don't know, but rather there actually is no way to know. There's no explanation. The more costly the hypothesis. For instance, if we have 2 hypotheses, for any particular phenomenon, it doesn't matter. One hypothesis has internal to it 2 commitments to inexplicable phenomena, and the second hypothesis explains those 2 phenomena, and all else is equal, the second hypothesis is far more virtuous and preferable and more likely true. Right, so if we deny the explanatory principle, we get this difficulty. I'm concrete, contingent. There's an explanation for the fact that I exist. So are you. So is there an explanation for the fact that you exist? So are most things, contingent and concrete, alike in that they have an explanation, but then there's just this category of things, and for no reason, they exist unexplained. Right? So not only do they exist unexplained, but there's no reason for why they exist unexplained. So you're positing not 1, but 2 arbitrary inexplicable phenomena. That is deeply problematic. All right, now that I have defined the terms, disambiguated some confusions, responded to some criticisms, gave support for the premises, I'm now going to respond to the single objection to the argument in the entire comment section that was actually mildly philosophically competent. Mildly. Which is sad. There was a lot of comments. There was only one that was actually worthy of response, philosophically speaking. I'll read the objection out loud here. I reject premise 2. It could be a circular contingency. Then they write, as an example, A depends on B, B depends on C, C depends on A. All of A, B, and C could be contingent, with no necessary concrete thing. This would satisfy premise 1 while rendering 2 incoherent. Then they follow up with a second objection. But what's the problem with this one? So I noted 3 difficulties with it in the comments. The 3 difficulties with it are as follows. First, most philosophers reject the notion of circular explanation. Most philosophers think circular explanation is the same as self-explanation. Now, in the terms of a contingent thing, again, the vast majority of philosophers think that that's an absolutely incoherent notion. Right? Imagine, for example, I cause myself. I explain my own existence. Let's say I claim that I exist because I did a set of actions that produced myself. Why is that incoherent? Well, in order to do those actions, I have to already exist. And we could probably derive some contradiction formally from making the claim that my actions produced my very existence, but I don't have patience for that. So those are two separate objections. The first objection is a probabilistic objection from academic consensus, right? If most academic philosophers agree or converge on some particular point, that the point of convergence is more probably correct than incorrect. So that's reason number one. Response number two was that circular explanation is arguably just incoherent. What's true in the case of self-causation is no different in the case of circular explanation. For example, if instead of using A, B, and C, I'll just use two variables, but it's also true of 3 or 5 or any amount. If A explains B, let's make this more clear. If A exists, and the reason it exists is because of B, and B exists, and the reason B exists is because of A, and I should probably stipulate that the reason A exists is entirely, that's the key point here, entirely because of B, and the reason B exists is entirely because of A, then it is true that for either A or B to exist, either one of them must already exist to do the explanatory work. Thus, we have the same difficulty that arises in circular explanation that arises in self-explanation. What's the third problem with this objection? The third problem with this objection is that I could grant circular explanation and just run a modal contingency cosmological argument. No, not contingency, a modal cosmological argument, and we'll get the same conclusion. And if someone disagrees, I could hash that out. All right, the second objection from the same person. Alternatively, there could be an infinitely long chain of contingencies such that there's no necessary concrete thing at the root of all of it. This argument does nothing. He's referring to my argument. This argument does nothing to rule out such a state of affairs. It may be tricky to think about it, but that hardly means it can't be the case. How do I put this? My argument is not in tension with there being an infinite regress of contingent things, for the very simple fact that if there is in fact an infinite regress of contingent things, and everything in the chain is explained, that's fine. I could still ask what explains the entirety of the chain. Or I could phrase this differently. I could say, what explains the instantiation of the type contingent thing? What explains that? And if you say, oh, contingent things, or the activities of contingent things, we get the same circularity difficulty, the same self-causation difficulty. So, yeah, an infinite regress does not answer why the very regress obtains in the first place. Oh, and the person 30 minutes ago responded to my response to his infinite regress point. I'm going to read his response. If we call into question the coherence of an infinite chain, on the grounds of, but what explains the chain at all, then we could do the same for a tree which starts with a necessary concrete thing. But what explains it? Question mark. We could say it is necessary, but we could say the infinite chain is necessary. It doesn't really get us anywhere productive. I don't think asking, why does something exist instead of nothing, is a productive line of inquiry. I don't expect that there is going to be an answer. It seems like it might be just a brute fact that this stuff exists. All right, so I'm responding to this objection completely spontaneously, and there seems to be a few problems and different points that the objection is highlighting. So here's the response. If I ask what explains the chain, and I defer to some necessary thing that explains it, and you respond, why don't you just call the chain itself necessary? That's fine. You could do that. But then you'd be granting the first stage of my argument. The whole thing the first stage of my argument is attempting to do is establish that at least something is necessary. Now, if you want to make the claim that it's the chain that's necessary, we can move on to stage 2, wherein I attempt to show that the necessary thing has got to be God or God-like. To say that the infinite chain here is itself necessary is just to grant my conclusion. All I was trying to do is reach a necessary being. That's the first thing. And then he says, why does something exist instead of nothing? To be fair, that's not what I was doing. There are arguments predicated around that question that are very similar to the argument from contingency here, but they're not this argument. There are relevant differences. I'm not making the argument. I'm not asking why is there something rather than nothing. Rather, I'm asking why is there an infinite chain rather than, say, a finite chain, or no, chain at all, or a different infinite chain with different types of things in that chain. There's a lot of questions we could ask about the chain that are left unanswered if it's in fact infinite. I'm not asking per se. Why is there something rather than nothing? I could just be asking why this chain instead of a different one. What explains that contingent fact? All right, that concludes this video or whatever. And I want to see. This is not going to happen, but I'm just dying for somebody to actually engage with my argument. Why is it so difficult to engage with the argument? Stop rejecting it because I didn't define terms. You could be agnostic because I didn't define terms. Don't reject it. That's stupid. Don't reject it because I didn't support my premises. Engage with the argument, please. And when I post this video, the last thing I want is people in the comments to start haggling stupidly, which is going to happen. Oh, well, if you actually bring an argument but you don't offer supports for the premises, why should we accept it? I never made the claim you should accept it. I need to clarify this again. If an argument is not supported, you don't have to accept it. Of course. But don't reject it merely because I didn't offer justification. If I have to repeat that, look, if you ask about, oh, well, actually, lack of support entails rejection. If you ask about that in the comments, I'm not going to remove you, but I'm not responding. You're an idiot, okay? If you take difficulty with the things I've said, please let it be the supports for the argument or a rebutting defeater you have given its conclusion. Goodbye.